Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
Good evening and welcome to Unexplained Phenomena Australia. We're back for episode 14. And during the week I was thinking about what could I actually talk about this week. And I gave it some thought and I came up with the idea of looking at the Bass Strait Triangle. Yes, that's right, the Bass Strait Triangle. Similar to the Bermuda Triangle, but this is here in Australia. And Bass Strait, like the Bermuda Triangle, has some very, very strange activity that has occurred there over a very long time. And in aviation circles and in the shipping industry, people know the strait, but it also has its deep, dark secrets. So we'll have a good look tonight at everything to do with Bass Strait. And during the week, I had a really good look around, digging through books and online, and I found that there really is a huge amount of strange things that have occurred in that particular area. So where am I actually talking about? So this is the location of Bass Strait. So you can see a map of Australia, and that purple area down the bottom there, which represents the body of water between Tasmania and Australia. That is Bass Strait. And this is another map that also gives you a bit of an idea. So there's Tasmania. And the island chain on the right is Flinders Island, and the island chain off to the left is King Island, and that's where Fred Valentich was flying to in 1978 when he disappeared over this body of water. And you can't really talk about Bass Strait without talking about Fred Valentich, and I did an episode on him a few weeks ago, so we will talk about him again, but only sort of in a grace note kind of a way. I sort of want to really focus on looking at other strange aspects to do with the strait. So I'm just going to hide that and bring back my smiling face for you. So Bass Strait is generally very shallow, an average depth of 50 meters or 160 feet. And it's a stretch of water that's approximately 300 kilometers wide and 200 kilometers from north to south. And it's encompassed by the entire northern coastline of Tasmania and Victoria's central to eastern coast. So where I live here in East Gippsland, when I go to the beach, I'm basically looking over the eastern side of Bass Strait. The prevailing winds and currents are westerly, and they sure are. They can certainly blow. And the latter being divided by King Island, Tasmania, at the western entrance to the strait, causing unpredictable sea conditions. especially when strong winds occur. For example, strong southerly winds can cause a strong northerly current reflecting from the Victorian coast. And the combination of wind, currents, tidal flow, and the shallow bottom often leads to tall waves, often of short length, with a confused short swell, often conflicting in directions. So it's a very dangerous stretch of water when it's raging. It really is. And I've crossed it myself about, I've had 4 trips to Tasmania, so that's all of them were on the boat. So I've been across the strait 8 times. And I've been across it when it's been as calm and as flat as a billiard table with a full moon night, to another time when I went over and you couldn't stand up. You had to lay on your bed because the boat was going up and down so much across there. So it can be a very violent, turbulent, and also flat and calm body of water, extremely unpredictable. So all the shipping to the busy ports of Melbourne, in Victoria, Stanley, Burnie, Devonport and Launceston on Tasmania, and even King Island and Flinders Island, all shipping must pass through Bass Strait. And it's also the route of choice for many ships passing from the Australian west coast to the east coast. And most air traffic between Tasmania and the Australian mainland flies in at least part of it or adjacent to Bass Strait. So it's very hard for the transport industry to not engage with this rather interesting body of water. So we're going to have a look at some of the strange, well, that's not so much strange. We'll have a look at some of the disappearances that have occurred in Bass Strait. Because the Fred Valentich case, which I mentioned before, it kind of is the centerpiece and hallmark event that really brought the world's attention to this body of water. And just as a little bit of a recap on that, there's Fred and a mock-up of his plane. There's a picture of Fred again. And this picture perhaps shows you what sort of a furlough it actually did cause at the time. So it made headlines. So that incident sort of made people sort of go, well, what else has occurred in this area? And even this week, having a look through, it's just been sort of incredible. Now, some of the things I'm going to read to you, they may have natural explanations. There may be perfectly normal reasons why tragedy struck in some of these cases and some of these aircraft and some of these ships. But each and every one of them is still, no one knows definitively what happened to these vessels and to some of the aircraft that I'm going to talk about, including another very experienced pilot. So that said, we'll make a start and we'll have a look at sort of the pre-20th century accounts. So going back to the 19th century, perhaps the 18th century, going back in time to when white settlers first had their experiences with Bass Strait. And there were many reports of ships disappearing during the 19th century. And in fact, that's almost a logical thing because you're talking about the boats from a much older period, and they would have encountered storms and they would have had problems. There's no question about that. But the thing to pay attention to in the cases I'm going to talk about today is that they all were still mysteries, still unknown fates. So, and that'll come out even more as we get to the end of this week's episode and I start talking about some more bizarre stuff towards the end. So you've got to hang around for that. So the first recorded incident of a disappearance was of a ship called the Eliza in 1797. So that's pretty early. Australia was officially discovered in 1788. So not that long after. And the vessel was part of a salvage operation for the Sydney Cove, another boat, which had recently become wrecked on the rocky coast. And the Eliza seemingly vanished off the face of the earth during the rescue attempt. Nobody really knows what happened. In 1858, the British ship the HMAS Sappo, Sappho, met the same fate as it ventured into the Strait's deadly waters. It sailed from the Cape of Good Hope for Sydney on the 8th of January 1858, but failed to arrive. As she was not expected in Sydney, her non-appearance didn't really cause any concern until later in the year. So the ship hasn't come in, but no one's really concerned. In October 1858, Admiral Loring in Sydney was informed that the Sappo had been seen by the crew of the schooner, the Yarrow, off Cape Bridgewater, Victoria, at the western entrance to Bass Strait on the 18th of February. Extensive searches by a number of vessels, including the HMAS Elk and the HMVS Victoria, failed to find any trace of the Sappo that had disappeared. And later in 1858, rumours began spreading in England that the vessel had been wrecked on an island off the coast of Australia, and that some of the survivors had been rescued, and that the captain, Captain Moresby, had gone insane. And these rumours did the rounds of the international press for over a year as they were picked up and passed along. And there was no truth to any of these rumours. They couldn't be substantiated in any way. And a similar event took place, this is in Bass Strait, again, 12 years later, when the Harlech Castle disappeared. I think actually, before I go too much further, I've got an image of the Sappo here. It's easy to get ahead of your slide. So that's what she looked like, the HMAS Sappo. So this is another time and place when you're talking about these sort of ships. So the Harlech Castle, which 12 years later, took 23 crew members with her when she disappeared, and it disappeared after leaving Melbourne, Victoria, for Newcastle in New South Wales. And on the 26th of June 1870, with a crew of 23, and she was an iron clipper of 1,112 tons, so it wasn't exactly a little ship. And a vessel resembling her was seen by another ship at the schooner called the Alcandre, about 60 nautical miles south of Cape Howe, and she appeared to be listing badly. The government steamer Pharos searched Bass Strait and its eastern approaches without result. So it's a couple of examples. And in the early days, you can probably easily say, yeah, well, that ship was seen listing. You know, they could have come to very much natural demises and be on the bottom of the Southern Ocean. But it starts to build the mystery of the Strait. When they can find nothing. You're talking big ships, you're talking things floating in the water, you're talking oil slicks and things like that as we get further on. So the Strait is swallowing ships up. That's the starting point for it. And it's very likely that there's so many more examples of ships that probably haven't even been recorded. These are just some of the bigger ships and the more famous ones. And if there's something in this stretch of water, perhaps some naturally occurring phenomenon that we simply don't understand, it's unlikely to be a recent occurrence and more likely has been happening for centuries. And unless the reasons for the bounty of ships and planes and people that have gone missing over the years in the Bass Strait Triangle is uncovered, more mysterious incidents are likely to continue to happen for more years in the future. Although, having said that, hasn't been any real recent instances of ships or planes disappearing. This has tended to have been a 18th, 19th, and perhaps 20th century sort of a phenomenon to this point. But it's all very interesting. Now we're going to have a look at an aircraft, which is the Miss Hobart. In October 1934, so we're coming right up into the 20th century, while crossing Bass Strait in perfect weather conditions for flying, the airliner Miss Hobart vanished without a trace. There were 12 passengers and 2 pilots. Neither they nor even the smallest amount of wreckage was ever discovered, despite extensive searches by military aircraft and vessels in the water. And aviation experts both at that time in 1934 and today, believe that the loss of the Miss Hobart to be a genuine mystery, not least due to the de Havilland DH-86 aircraft being one of the most advanced of its era. It made use of 4 independent engines, with the likelihood of all 4 engines failing at the same time being almost universally dismissed, that it could not possibly have lost all 4 engines. And the plane was designed so that it should have been able to be guided in to an emergency landing. Strange. 1934, and I can show you a picture of it. This is it here. So that's the Miss Hobart. Quite an unusual looking aircraft, but that disappeared. It was basically a mail plane and carried passengers as well. So it just disappeared. And we will look at that a little bit more. And this all adds context and gravista to the Fred Valentich disappearance, and this case does particularly. So the last transmission from the Miss Hobart spookily mirrors Fred Valentich's experience. The crews allegedly claim they could hear the sound of a plane around them, and there were several reports of an aerial machine coming towards them. That's very similar to Fred Valentich. They then reported that the humming sound had suddenly stopped, and nothing more was heard from the Miss Hobart after that. That's the point where she was disappeared off the face of the earth. So on Friday the 19th, October the 19th, 1934, the alarm went out that the airline of the Miss Hobart had gone missing between Launceston and Melbourne, Launceston being in northern Tasmania. And she had 12 people on board, 10 Tasmanians, 7 men, including the Reverend Warren of St Mary's Township on the east coast, 2 women, one with a small child. The Reverend Hubert Warren was on his way to take over St Thomas's Church, Enfield in Sydney. His wife and children deciding not to accompany him, but had planned to travel to Sydney by steamer, which was a good result for them. One of the women was a Miss Kay Mercer, a well-known competitive horse rider from Campbelltown in the Midlands in New South Wales. One of the men was Garnet Rupert Gorelay, who had served the 1st Battalion Commonwealth Horse during the Anglo-Boer War and later with the 40th Battalion in World War I. And Mr. Gilbert Jenkins and Captain V.C. Holliman, traffic manager of Holliman's Airways, piloted the airliner. And Gilbert Jenkins was ex-Royal Australian Air Force and ex-Canadian Air Force, with which he had commanded a squadron. And after leaving the service, Mr. Jenkins had further comprehensive flying experience, commuting between the mainland and Tasmania many, many times. And it was only in July at the same year that he had accepted the post with Holliman's Airways, the owners of the Miss Hobart. And the plane was so these pilots were experienced guys. They were no dummies. They had many hours experience flying. So you've got a perfectly serviceable aircraft and 2 skilled pilots behind the wheel. And so the plane was last heard from at about 10:20 when it approached the Victorian coast. So it was getting quite close to Victoria. And a message was received at Laverton stating that they were over Redondo Island, all's well. That was the message. And there are indicators that it had passed over Wilson's Promontory. But what happened next remains a mystery. And no final conclusion was ever reached by the subsequent inquiry after this plane disappeared into nothing. As soon as it was apparent that Miss Hobart was overdue, the alarm bells were rang. And Holliman's Airways Proprietary Limited immediately contacted the Civil Aviation Department, and a Desalter monoplane began searching the area immediately. The visibility was good that late afternoon, and as time progressed with no results, other planes joined in the search. And at dawn on Sunday, October the 21st, that's a significant date. That's the date that Fred Valentich disappeared. So very, very interesting that you've got, this is happening in October. This plane disappeared in October. Fred disappeared in October. And that comes back again a little bit later on. So as dawn on that day of Sunday, October 21st, significant date, the Royal Australian Air Force sent out a supermarine flying boat, and the route from Tasmania to Essendon in 1934 was northeast from Western Junction over Flinders Island, following a line from the small islands in Bass Strait north of Flinders to Janaki Aerodrome, where emergency supplies of petrol were kept, and on to Essendon. That was the sort of the flight route. And Miss Hobart was under contract to the Commonwealth and had only begun its Melbourne, Launceston and Hobart services on October the 1st. So the plane itself had only done a couple of trips back and forth, really, not even a month. And in the test flights, the plane had shown no indications of any problems at all. It flew 3 times a week, usually by way of King Island from Melbourne to Tasmania and by the way of Flinders Island on the return journey. Besides the 10 passengers, it carried airmail, and all of the occupants of Miss Hobart were enclosed in one large cabin. So they started debating what could have possibly gone wrong. A possible cause of trouble was the plane might have run out of petrol, perhaps because of a leakage, but they couldn't be sure. And over the weekend, the search was intensified, but only one clue of importance was found: a large patch of oil located by the Southampton flying boat near Citadel Island, about 10 miles west of Wilson's Promontory. And there was further hope. A collier steaming in the vicinity witnessed 2 flares at Lip Trap, but although they steamed close to the beach, they saw nothing. And later it was revealed that the Miss Hobart didn't even carry flares. 6 planes had now joined the search, including Miss Launceston, sister plane to Miss Hobart. But besides the oil slick, there was little other evidence, and the search was joined by a number of ships, including coastal steamers, but no wreckage or any other clue was discovered. And the search order was broadened, and samples of the oil slick were taken for analysis to determine whether the film was caused by oil similar to those used in the engines of Miss Hobart. Now, two surveyors who were working between a lighthouse and the National Park's chalet told authorities they heard an aircraft droning sound behind the big mountain in that area called Mount Oberon, and then suddenly it was silent. So they said they'd heard this plane traveling along. They were down on the ground at that time, and all of a sudden it went silent. And a nearby ship's captain, Mr. J. Millington, reported a bright flash in the sky above Cape Lip Trap. Strange. So by the Monday, October the 23rd, it became apparent that this search was pretty much fruitless, and the Civil Aviation Department decided to abandon it. And the belief was that the craft had fallen into Bass Strait and there was no hope for its passengers. So it was pretty much, they sort of had to give up. And some believed at the time that the pilots of the Miss Hobart were forced to attempt a pancake landing on the ocean's surface. So, and in such a case, the Miss Hobart would have all probably dived straight for the seabed and there would have been no wreckage on the surface. So, but they really don't know what happened. So the Duke of Gloucester, who was visiting Australia at the time, sent the following message to the Governor of Tasmania: "I am profoundly distressed at the loss of the airliner, Miss Hobart. Please convey my deepest sympathy to the relatives and dependents of all those who lost their lives." And telegrams from the Governor-General and the Governor of Victoria came as well. So, but by the Friday of that week, October the 26th, the disaster was slipping out of the headlines. So, and although ships had passed through the area where the craft was believed to have been downed, there was no further reports of wreckage. So, and the belief that it had crashed into Bass Strait was accepted, but there was no definitive proof. You've got a perfectly serviceable aircraft flown by 2 highly skilled and trained pilots on a beautiful, clear and sunny morning, just disappear. Talking about all's well. There's reports of a sound of another craft around them, and they disappear. So that's the Miss Hobart, and that really echoes the Fred Valentich case really a lot. So, and it's such a beautiful looking craft. It really is. Now, another strange incident that occurred was the Loiner incident, which was almost a year after the disappearance of Miss Hobart. Another plane, the Loiner, and I've got a picture of that one as well. There we go. So this one would vanish while travelling from Melbourne to Tasmania. The aircraft had just radioed the control tower in Tasmania to say it was preparing to make its approach to land when suddenly it went silent. It carried 3 passengers and 2 pilots. While none of the 5 people on board were ever located, a search of the water did recover some minimal wreckage. 3 of the plane's seats were discovered, as well as pieces of the petrol tank. Perhaps most intriguingly, however, was a small piece of floor of the plane. There appeared to be a burnt patch only several centimetres wide. Further analysis suggested the area had been in flames, and other materials appeared to show someone had tried to intensely stamp it out. Whether this small detail had anything to do with the fate of the plane is unknown. So in this particular case, they did find wreckage of the plane. So the plane, you could say, didn't disappear outright. The plane definitely crashed. But there was, again, no real reason for this plane to disappear. Now, all of this will tie in and make a lot more sense once I get to the end and you start to see some of the strange history around the Bass Strait area. So there we go. Now, another famous disappearance in the Bass Strait was of a ship called the SS Amelia J. So this is the Amelia J here. This leads into another disappearance. There we go. So in 1920, while sailing in the Bass Strait, the SS Amelia J disappeared without a trace, shortly after entering the infamous stretch of water. And the Australian military would conduct an extensive search of the area. However, one of the military aircraft involved in the search also vanished. And perhaps strangest about the incident are reports of strange lights being seen in the skies over Bass Strait at the time that the ship disappeared. So what happened? The Amelia J was a 3-masted schooner of 404 tonnes, a fairly big boat. And she sailed from Newcastle bound for Hobart on the 21st of August 1920 with coal and a total crew of 12, but she failed to arrive. She was last seen off Jervis Bay, New South Wales, by the crew of the SS Melbourne on the 5th of September 1920. And her owner arranged for SS Musgrave to conduct a search of the Furneaux group of islands down near Tasmania, beginning what was probably the largest search for a missing vessel yet conducted in Australia. And that was in 1920, and the first one to make use of aircraft. And the government initially refused to send a warship in search of the Amelia J, but the public outcry was so great that the HMAS Platypus was sent to investigate the islands, and as that was considered to be the most likely spot that the vessel may have come to grief. At the same time, another ship called the Southern Cross also had disappeared around the same time, and this is the Southern Cross. So that was a wooden barkentine 257-ton wooden ex-auxiliary steamer, 291 tons gross, of quite another substantial ship called the Southern Cross. And it was originally a steam yacht built for missionary purposes by missions to the South Pacific, and it was sold for commercial purposes and converted to a sailing ship in 1904. And it left Melbourne on September 11, 1920 for Hobart with a case of oil, and it's believed but not known to have taken fire, exploded and lost with all hands. Yet no wreckage of any kind or any trace of the crew was found. So the Southern Cross and the Amelia J both disappeared. So on the 23rd of September 1920, 2 de Havilland biplanes, 9A biplanes, just to be specific, were sent off look for to search for both ships. And that's the first plane that was used in searching for missing ships in Australia. So, which is really interesting. And one of these planes was flown by Major Stutt, Stutt, who was last seen flying into heavy cloud on the northwestern coast of Cape Barren Island before he disappeared. And the search for the missing schooner had to be extended to cover the plane as well. Now, Captain Stutt, he was an Englishman. This is going to show you again that this guy was no slouch. He joined the Australian Army on the 29th of July 1919 to be a local and temporary captain while employed at the Central Flying School at Point Cook in Victoria. And when he and Major Anderson were ordered to search for the missing Amelia J and Southern Cross, they decided to sweep over the Bass Strait Islands before proceeding down the Tasmanian east coast. The two aircraft set out together, but apparently became separated in clouds off the northeast coast. And they'd been instructed to fly at 12,000 feet. This crucially giving them a gliding range of 12 to 15 miles in the event of engine trouble, enabling them to land on an island or the mainland. Now, Captain Stutt was a capable, qualified pilot, and his DH de Havilland 9A aircraft was in first class order. And there was no known clue as to what could have caused him and his plane to disappear. So the HMAS Platypus was later withdrawn to search for survivors of the Southern Cross, and it was replaced by the destroyer Swordsman. And other searches were conducted around the Furneaux group of islands were carried out by the SS Dolphin, a motor launch called the Torque, and the SS Melbourne. No trace of either schooner or aircraft was ever found. Really, really interesting. So I know that sounds like a big history lesson, but it sort of sets the tone, and it shows you that Fred's disappearance in 1978 did have echoes back through the previous decades and even into the previous centuries. And those two other plane disappearances are kind of eerie in itself too, with the Miss Hobart being, a top liner for that plane with great pilots, and also Captain Stutt being a top quality man with a top quality plane. So the mystery was really quite high as to what had happened, and the two ships that had gone as well. So it's you can't say that the two ships necessarily had some type of paranormal interaction, but then you can't say that they didn't either, and that's going to come out a little bit more as we travel through. So we're going to fast forward a few years now. We're going to come into around 1967, around this time. So once I read through what I'm going to have a look at now, you're sort of going to start seeing that the strait itself is a hotbed for paranormal activity. And so in 1967, there was a flap of UFOs over Tasmania and Bass Strait. And the activity peaked around August, which is winter here, middle of summer in the Northern Hemisphere, with more than a dozen sightings on both sides of the strait. Most came from Tasmania, and a strange object was observed as bright lights grouped together at the town of Burnie. And I'm just going to take you up and show you a little bit of a map of northern Tasmania. So that's northern Tasmania. And where the red dot is a town called Ulverston, and a little bit to the west of that, right on the coast, is another town called Burnie, about midway along on that map. So that's just something to have to bear in mind, just in relation to this. So bright lights grouped together around that town of Burnie on the north coast, which is the boundary of Bass Strait. Minutes later, the object was reported over Ulverston, that other image with the little red dropper on it, 28 kilometres away. Minutes later, 28 kilometres away, by a police constable. The policeman noted 6 lights in formation turn and fly out over the strait. So these strange lights turned around and flew out over the strait. Another sighting came from a motorist on his way to Burnie, and he saw a bright cigar-shaped object suddenly appear from the west, about 200 meters in the sky, and the object was long and brightly illuminated. After a minute, the lights began to fade, and it then accelerated and disappeared. This is all within the same time. So he also shows you that you can have one object appear and then other objects appear, when you have flaps. And this, I think, is what's happening down in Tasmania at that time. And 2 days later, 6 UFOs were seen on the northeast tip of Tasmania. A Binalong Bay man and 7 people in a hunting party all saw the object. And so this is where that area is. This is over on the east coast of Tasmania. So the other map I showed you was right along there. And that Binalong Bay, so up to the north where that cape is at the top there, that's Bass Strait running around the top of it. So this is only just down and just out of the Bass Strait area. So at that area, 6 UFOs were seen on the northeast tip of Tasmania at that bay. And 7 people in a hunting party all saw the object. And 3 years later, another man, Mr. Glatty, reported to the Royal Australian Navy that he had seen a mysterious object at Binalong Bay. And he said, so 1967, so he moved up to about 1970. He said it seemed to rise out of the water. This object seemed to rise out of the water. And it was also spotted by 2 men at St. Helens, which is also on the same coast, and who said it was about the size of a porpoise. And they said it moved very slowly, high into the sky, suddenly turned direction as it neared Bass Strait. It was a cigar shape without wings, but left a vapor trail. The men had seen some same type of object before. So they'd seen that same type of object before, but it had went away in the opposite direction. So we've got these UFO reports that are occurring right on the coast, the northern coast, the northeastern coast, the central coast, right on that southern boundary of Bass Strait. And also, earlier in the year, in 1970, 3 young men stopped their car between Burnie and Ulverstone, and that's back to this map here. So there's Ulverstone's the dropper, and Burnie's just off to the left, a little bit further along, right on the coast. So it's in this area here on the north central, and that's Bass Strait, that big body of water on that map. So 3 young men stopped their car between Burnie and Ulverstone after watching a strange phenomenon over the strait. So they're looking out over Bass Strait. And a young man took a photo which showed 4 objects surrounded by a shadowy haze. And the witnesses said the object appeared to be white and hovered for a while, these 4 objects out over Bass Strait. 2 months later, not far from the same spot, 2 other independent men noticed an object twisting and turning at blistering speed over the water. And it was seen by another man who gave a similar description. And aviation authorities claimed that there was no aircraft in the area at that time. So this is flaps in 67, flaps in 1970. And don't forget that all these reports are fairly, you don't get all the reports. You just don't. I can't even access all the reports. This is just the stuff that I'm finding that ties all this together, this Bass Strait triangle, the ships disappearing, the 3 aircraft disappearing, and then you've got a strong history of UFO activity in the area. And 3 days later, in that same area, a strange craft with a green tail flashed across the sky early in the morning and went out to sea over near the Binalong area. So sorry, it wasn't at Ulverstone, it was over on the east coast. So again, we've got a 3rd report here, right on the almost on the northeastern tip of Tasmania, right up there where Bass Strait is. So this strange craft with a green tail flashed across the sky in the morning and went out to sea near the Billabong area. And so sightings along Tasmania's north coast continued right throughout that year, again reaching their peak in August. So 1972 was a very big UFO year, and I've spoken about that in other episodes. And there's none more so really, and around Tasmania and Bass Strait is no exception either. So in 1972, a man called Bill Meerton on June 16 was leaving his house at 8:30 when he looked back inside his house, and he saw an orange glow in the kitchen. And he was thinking that he'd left the light on, but all the lights had been switched off. And he stepped out the back door and he came face to face with a solid, dull, metallic object, which was 10 meters long, 5 meters high, and it had approximately 30 orange lights on its whole area. And it lit up the whole area. It was lit up by the object, and a fierce wind was blowing. This is at 8:30 at night on June 16, 1972. So the object has had this orange light coming in through his kitchen window. He's gone outside and he's come face to face with this 10-meter long, 5-meter high craft. And there was an increase in sightings around September, October 1972. So that's when the Miss Hobart disappeared in 1934. Fred Valentich disappeared in October 1978. And here we have around September, October 1972, reports from northern Tasmania. And as far away as Victoria, across the other side of Bass Strait, over here where I am, near where I live, in nearby towns of Sale, which is about a 50-minute drive from here, and Traralgon, which is an hour and a half from here. So at this same time, just off the coast on the Victorian side, there's a lot of strange things going on. And in 1976, a middle-aged man on the northeast coast of Tasmania believes he may have seen figures inside a UFO. And the object hovered just above the ground and was no more than 25 meters away from him. And there was a white light emanating from the bottom. And each window was dome-shaped, and the craft looked like aluminium. And through 4 windows, the man said he could see motionless shapes that either looked like high bucket seats of a car, and he didn't know if he had seen seats or something sitting on them. And the object flew off at fantastic speed and was out of sight in 8 seconds. So northeast Tasmania is over on that, with that, like that Bennelong Bay, that northeast, over on the eastern side of Bass Strait. So it's interesting to say, like, did those ships back in the 19th century, did they encounter anything out there in the water? Nothing was found. Not even a stitch of timber. Nothing from any of those ships. And I'm not saying that they can't sink to the bottom with and everything go with them. I'm sure they can. But with ships disappearing, you'd think there'd be some type of wreckage, some type of debris as ships sink, then things billow up to the top. So, including bodies. And that just didn't happen. And scores of reports followed in 1977 from mid to southern areas of Victoria all the way down to Hobart. And a strange craft was seen at Moe in Victoria. Moe is probably about an hour and 3/4 from where I'm sitting right now. So I was only drove through it on the weekend. And this was seen in Moe, and it was travelling from the Bass Strait area. And it was almost 2 years to the day that Fred disappears, again in October 1977. And the object was seen by 3 teenage boys at 7:40 p.m. And the night was dark and quiet, but it was clear. And the oval-shaped object was well lit by a white light, and it stopped and hovered over the trees. And the boys claimed that it had legs and was the size of the moon from where they were, and they were about 500 meters away. And after 5 minutes, it suddenly vanished without a sound. Interesting. Now we're going to go a little bit further away from Bass Strait, but not that far really. We're going to go to New Zealand. And this is a very strange case that it's so strange, but I love it. And I'm sure you'll find it interesting as well. So in that 1978 period, and this was in the town of Gisborne. I'm just going to show a quick map for reference. So this is New Zealand, and this is the North Island, and the town of Gisborne is where that red dropper is. Just to sort of give you that that perspective. So I know I've digressed a little, but it's time frame. It's time frame. It's all time frame. And if you're in a UFO, I'm sure you can fly from Bass Strait to New Zealand in a flash, no problem at all, and come back again anytime you like. So this is all a very small area when you're talking about craft that can behave in these ways. And this is an extremely strange case. So in Gisborne, a farmer, he saw a flying saucer land on his farm, open its doors inward, and there was a bright red interior that was emanating out, like a bright interior light. And the farmer happened to look down towards his dog kennels, and he saw a really strange sight. He saw two humanoids carrying one of his dogs, between them running towards the craft. And the humanoids were 4 foot 8 inches tall, and they wore metallic silver suits and white opaque helmets. The farmer raised his gun and fired, hitting one of the humanoids, and the pair of them dropped the dog, and the wounded humanoid scurried off into the bushes, and the other one into the craft, which took off vertically and at great speed. And the dog, which had been unconscious, stood up and started barking. And the humanoid in the bush had vanished. And later the same day, granular pieces of blue-green crystallized material rained down on a car travelling in the area. And there were dozens of sightings in the Gisborne area within 19 days of this bizarre farm incident, also in the 1978 time period. So this is a very active time. We've got the Bass Strait, we've got the Tasmanian cases, we've got Fred Valentich, we've got extreme UFO activity, and you could say high strangeness cases occurring over in New Zealand, in Gisborne. So, and there's so many more cases, that are around this 1978 period, and in the following weeks before and Fred disappeared, other cases cropped up. So, for example, on October 9, a husband and wife witnessed a bright light above them actually come down to the level of their car and maintain pace beside them as they drove in Tasmania on October the 9th, 1978. So about a fortnight before Fred disappeared. And by the time you get to a month later, so early September, after Fred's disappearance, a taxi driver in Hobart was suddenly forced to slam on his brakes due to a strange green glow in the middle of the road. Weird. His communication radio also went out. And by the time he had returned his gaze to the road, the green object was nowhere to be seen. And on November 25th, so Fred disappeared October 21st, now we've moved through to November 25th in Sandford, Tasmania, a woman reported a doorway of light suddenly appearing in the front of her property. And perhaps even stranger, she could see through the doorway to her driveway on the other side. So it's almost like some sort of a gateway or a portal had appeared. And another interesting little addendum to Fred Valentich is in relation to a young guy called Jason Manifold. And his father had taken this famous photograph when Fred had disappeared. He took 6 photos, and the last photo showed this strange object with with sort of like crystal lights off to the left and some sort of a cloud off to the right. Definitely a physical object, not an imperfection in the film. Very famous photo. So the son of the man who took that photo, he said that on the evening in question, Jason remained outside watching the sky. And although he didn't see anything, he could hear the sound of a plane engine overhead. This is at the time Fred Valentich disappeared. And instead of gradually fading off into the distance, the engine suddenly came to a stop as if someone had turned a radio off. And then there was nothing but silence. So at the time Fred disappeared, at the same time that his father took the photograph on the beach, the son Jason is saying he heard a plane flying and then he heard nothing. It had just stopped. So this is all context. Then in 1979, going back to boats, a yacht, the Charleston, which was this boat here. I've got a picture of it right here. So in December 1979, so a year and a few months after Fred disappeared, the Charleston, along with 5 crew members, would vanish without a trace while sailing along Bass Strait. The yacht was scheduled to arrive in Sydney for New Year's Eve, and it was to take part in the Sydney to Hobart yacht race, which is a famous yacht race. And the last report that was received was on the 10th of December, when its skipper, millionaire Hobart businessman Charles Davies, who's pictured there in that photo, he radioed that he was off Babel Island in Bass Strait and making good progress. And that was the last anyone heard. And the Charleston failed to reach its destination. And given that it was only a year after the Fred Valentich incident, the public was puzzled and fearful of the waters of Bass Strait. And with no contact and no arrival, search planes were sent out in a desperate bid to find the apparently stricken vessel. And then all the theories came up. So nothing of the boat or the people on board was ever discovered. And then all the logical explanations come out, like it was possible that damage could have been inflicted upon the mast, or perhaps a loose container from the ships passing through the area had damaged the rudder. And that's the big loose containers we're talking about. If this was the case, it's possible that the yacht could have drifted as far as the islands south of New Zealand. And famously, in an absolute desperation for information, family members of the crew even visited a clairvoyant who stated that the crew had come upon an island south of their known last location. But I don't know what you can put into that. And the yacht's fate, to this day, is still a mystery. Even in World War II, there was strange incidences. 17 military planes were lost over Bass Strait, 17 during World War II. Now, it must be said that was a training base at the time, and they were training in aircraft and flying fast and low out over the water. So no doubt there would have been accidents, and I believe there was even faults with the Beaufort bombers at that time, and many planes were actually lost. But 17 jets were lost over, not jets, this is pre-jet era. The planes were lost over Bass Strait. And in 1944, a strange dark shadow came out of nowhere and flew beside a Bristol Beaufort bomber for almost 20 minutes over Bass Strait. So here's one of these bombers flying along, and a dark shadow came along and tracked with the Beaufort bomber for 20 minutes over Bass Strait. And then, without warning, it shot straight up at an amazing pace and vanished. And 2 years earlier, in 1942, an Australian fighter pilot took his plane over the Bass Strait after orders to investigate reports of strange lights made by fishermen. And as he surveyed the area, a huge bronze disc came out of the clouds and settled alongside the plane for several moments before vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. So I hope I've been able to give you a really good insight into that stretch of water, the Bass Strait, the infamous Bass Strait, all the way back from the 19th century and right through up until the 20th century. There's been many strange incidences, lots of UFO reports around Tasmania. What I've talked about today is just a small smattering. It really is. There's a lot more cases out there, and I'll dig more up to talk about Tasmanian cases in greater detail. So thank you so much for joining me today or tonight. And I really look forward to seeing you again next week when we delve deeply into unexplained phenomena as it relates to Australia. And I really hope that you have a fantastic night and just ponder over some of these things that we've been talking about, and even perhaps do your own research if you like, and look at some of those boats, look at some of those planes. In an hour's show, there's only so much you can actually do. But until next week, have a great week.